Hi everyone, welcome to our last lecture for Unit 1. This will cover 1.5 to 1.10 in the reading. And in this, we're going to look at power, authority, legitimacy, federal and unitary systems, and political stability. So let's start with 1.5, which is sources of power and authority. First, let's define power and authority. Power is the ability to control or direct others. In other words, you can exercise one's will over others. Authority is the right to control and direct others. That's accepted or legitimized as a power. So let me give you an example of the difference. In Nigeria, terrorism from Boko Haram uses tactics to intimidate and use terrorist activities in northern Nigeria to get things their way. So they have power, especially in the states in northern Nigeria. But they lack the authority of the power they are using because that power is not accepted or legitimized by either the government or the citizens of the country. So that's the difference between the two. You might have the power to do something, but not the authority to do it. So there's several sources of authority, okay, where power can be used with authority. The first one is constitutions, which is a governing document, of course. 5 of our 6 countries have written constitutions. Next is religions. This is especially important in Iran, where religion is supreme and built into the constitution, actually as the supreme law, as interpreted by the supreme leader of Iran. Military forces can be used as a source of power that has been legitimized by the government with authority, as well as political parties can be used as sources of power, as we will see in Russia. Legislatures also can be sources of power as they make and authority because they make the laws and policies. And finally, popular support from citizens is a source of authority too, because if the citizens agree to you using the power as a government, then that is a legitimate use of power. Okay. Now, I just want to compare a few of our countries, for example, of their sources of authority, how they're similar and different. So in Iran, for example, the Iranian revolutionaries deposed the Shah in the 1979 revolution, where the Ayatollah Khomeini then created a new constitution that established a theocracy, led to the transition to a theocracy based on Islamic Sharia law as interpreted by him. He also oversaw the writing of the 1979 Constitution, which we will look at closer later, but that basically establishes religious law as supreme, and the concept of juris guardianship, or the guardianship of Islamic jurists, which basically is the religious oversight of the government, which ensures that Iran, as an Islamic theocracy, even though there's direct elections of some government officials, they are subordinate to the religious officials. In China, the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, holds ultimate authority. They have control over the military, which is called the People's Liberation Army, or the PLA, who were the main army under Mao that won the 1949 revolution, turning China into a communist country. Today, the General Secretary of the CCP is also the designated chair of China's Central Military Commission, so they still control the army, the military. And another thing that is a source of authority in China is the economic performance. As long as the economic performance continues to be good in China, that adds authority to the government. Now, there are some similarities. Both countries do have written constitutions, and in both countries, the militaries are powerful and play a strong role in both policymaking and in suppressing dissent, which maintains power and authority into the government. Now, looking at a couple of our transitional democracies of Nigeria and Mexico. In Nigeria, after the independence from British colonization in the 1960s, Nigeria did struggle to consolidate power and democratically elected leaders. This led to multiple coups and military and extended periods of military dictatorships and rules until 1999 with the ratification of the Constitution, which was a transition away from military rule and has held pretty stable since then. Also, there's the first peaceful transfer of power from one elected president to another, first occurred in 2007. And then you had the first peaceful transfer of power from a president of one party to a president of a rival party, which occurred in 2015 when Goodluck Jonathan lost his re-election attempt to the current president, Buhari. In Mexico, after Mexico's revolution, the government did create a constitution in 1917, but was dominated by a single party, the Institutional Revolutionary Party, also known as PRI, which did allow opposing parties to win some local elections, but the president is the most powerful figure in Mexico's government, and PRI dominated national politics all the way up until the 2000 election, where they lost to Vicente Fox of PAN. Since then, there have been numerous electoral reforms that have encouraged multi-party competition and freer and fairer elections. So those are things that have all increased Mexico's source of authority. Now, similarity, they both also have constitutions, and both of these countries have transitioned to multi-party republics. Nigeria from military rule to a multi-party republic, and Mexico from a dominance of PRI to a multi-party republic. A few other countries I just want to talk about quickly is that apply authority is, for example, in the UK, in the United Kingdom, there have been constitutional reforms that have devolved power to multiple parliaments, allowing the regime to maintain stability. In the United Kingdom, the Prime Minister is the most powerful governing official who gains office through appointment by the majority party of the House of Commons. UK does not have a written constitution. The British government ceremonies highlight the role of its unelected monarch as having ultimate authority to rule and to confer powers to the Prime Minister. However, the British monarch's actual powers have been greatly diminished by laws passed by the House of Commons, which is truly the most powerful political institution in the UK system. Since 1997, the House of Commons has increasingly devolved power to local governing powers to Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland, even without a constitution to guide the division of powers within the unitary, because, and we will get into this more later, but in the UK, there is a concept known as parliamentary sovereignty, which basically everything that the parliament passes is considered constitutional. And in Russia, when Vladimir Putin, the political elites backing of a strong president in Russia created the election rules that favor one party and favor Putin. When Vladimir Putin became Russia's president in 1999, there were dozens of parties elected to a highly fractured national legislature. But within 8 years of his first 2 terms as president, Putin helped create United Russia, which is now the dominant party in Russia, and only 3 other parties that consistently won some of the legislative elections. So Russia has become similar to what Mexico was under PRI, where United Russia is the dominant party and none of the other parties actually rival Russia in any way. All right. So, when we're looking at changes in power changes in power and authority, of how we're basically looking at how a regime chooses to use power in support of sovereignty, which is determined in large part by whether they are democratic or authoritarian in characteristics. Now, sovereignty, just to refresh your memory on the definition of that, refers to the authority of the state to govern itself without any outside or inside interference. Okay, democracies. Well, let's take a look at this table. In the democratic changes of power, such as the UK and Mexico, they tend to use electoral measures to encourage citizen participation, free, fair, and competitive elections, and limit military role in policymaking. Where with regimes with authoritarian characteristics such as China and Iran, they actually resist citizen participation in policymaking, lack free, fair, and competitive elections, and the military often plays a very strong role or important role in making policy. Okay. Now, when we're looking at in a democracy, if citizens can elect leaders and leaders can be seen as legitimate, this contributes to sovereignty. Coming back to this point here for a second. Democratic regimes actually have to use less power to maintain sovereignty because citizens tend to be happier. The power lies with the people or the citizens, so they're less likely to resist and more likely to respect the government. So looking at the types of regimes, first let's look at the difference between a change of regime versus a change of government. These are two very different things, and they're very easy to be confused. So a change in regime, a regime is when you change the way the state is organized. Rules and institutions are replaced, and this can be very gradual. So significant examples of this would be, going from an authoritarian regime to a democratic regime, such as Mexico in 2000, with the end of the pre-dominance, or Nigeria in 1909 with the end of military dictatorship into a democratic republic. Government changes is when the people or parties that occupy the institutions of the state change. So this usually happens more often than a regime change, and it can be either peaceful or violent. So examples of this would be like in the United Kingdom, when you change one prime minister for another. So when Theresa May was replaced by Boris Johnson, that was a change of government. Okay. Other examples that you can look at for regime change would be, or for government change, would be things like when President Obama was replaced by Trump in 2017, that is a government change. Or when Peña Nieto was replaced by López Obrador in 2019, that's a government change. President Hu to President Xi in 2012, which was a party mandate, but that is still a government change. Putin to Medvedev back to Putin was also a government change. The system of the political system did not change, just who was occupying the institutions of the state. In Iran, when President Ahmadinejad was replaced by President Rouhani in 2013 due to term limits, this is a government change. And finally, in 2015, when President Jonathan was replaced by Buhari, another government change. Okay. So some of the types of how regime change happens, there's two main ways. There's a coup or coup d'etat, which is a forcible takeover of governing power, usually or typically led by elites. It uses a force or a threat of force. And this was experienced in Nigeria between 1960 and 1999. Several coups, which we'll talk more about when we get to that, replaced each other or replaced democratically elected governments. Nigeria is currently on its fourth republic or its fourth attempt of a democratic government that so far seems to be pretty stable. Another one is a revolution, which is the removal and long-term replacement of a form of government, but it usually involves the masses rather than just the elites. It can be either violent or peaceful. Some examples of this, of course, is the Russian Revolution in 1917, when it went from an imperial monarchy to a communist country. China in 1949, when it went from an attempted democracy under Sun Yat-sen to the communists, and in Iran from 1979, when it went from a dictatorship under the Shah to the theocracy that it is now. All right. Federal and unitary systems. This is moving into, and I didn't label it, but this is moving into 1.7, looking at the difference between federal and unitary systems. So federal systems are systems of government where significant powers are given to subnational or regional governments, and those, I said that twice, but those powers are protected. Our three federal governments are Mexico, Nigeria, and Russia, though Russia's a little bit odd, which we'll talk about later. Advantages of the federal system: citizens can participate at multiple levels, local governments can respond to local needs, and it's less likely that one party will dominate the government, the full government. However, disadvantage: it can be slow and result in major inefficiency. It can be complicated for citizens to understand, like who to go to, who's in charge of what. And there also can be conflicts between levels of government, so between states, between regional governments and national governments, city governments and regional governments, and so on. Okay. A unitary system is a system of government where all the political authority is in the central or national government. And we have three unitary systems: UK, China, and Iran. The advantages of a unitary system is that there are consistent laws throughout the country. It's easier for citizens to understand, and the government can act quickly if it's needed. However, the disadvantages are that regional problems are more likely to be ignored. It's easier for one party to dominate, and regional governments have very little power. Okay, there's several factors that can cause a change in the relationship between central and regional governments. Some of these things include things like, for example, ethnic or religious cleavages, which can shift power either to a region or state or locality. This is very common in Nigeria, where there are over 250 different ethnic groups. It's one of the reasons why Nigeria has states, has federalism. Each one of those states are loosely based on a major ethnic group. There are currently 36 states, but when Nigeria first reached independence, it only had 12 states when it went from a parliamentary to a federal system, and it has been increasing states based on these ethnic rivalries. Supranational organizations such as the EU or the United Nations or things like that, these are organizations that bring together several member countries and have power over member countries, and they might have policies in place that dictate a country needs to give voice to the regions or to have a strong centralized government that requires them to either consolidate or devolve power. Threats from other countries can often lead to consolidating power in the central government for defense. Regional protests or discontent can lead to, can actually go either way, can either devolve or centralize government power. Protests in Iran were kind of cut short with the coronavirus, but that looked like it might have looking towards maybe devolving more power possibly. And then finally, terrorism, terrorist acts in a country can lead to a shift as well, one way or the other, either to the central government to deal with it or to regional governments that might have more ability to deal with it. So to kind of give some examples, the constitutions of Nigeria and Mexico both established a system of federalism, since both guarantee state governments in the respective countries have certain powers like state tax revenue. In Mexico, policies related to the legalization of abortion and criminal enforcement of abortion laws vary state by state. In the UK, there is no constitutional guarantee of distributing power to regional governments. Any powers that are devolved to the regional governments of the United Kingdom have been granted by enacted policy of the House of Commons. This establishes the UK as a unitary government, but it has, through devolution, has given power to the regional governments, which means different regions can have policies that are different in that have local differences in things like education and local transportation, but that power is not protected. The House of Commons can take it away at any time. The Russian Constitution does establish federalism, with protected powers for regional governments, but Putin and Russia's national government have centralized powers after the 2004 terrorist attack from Chechnyan rebels on a school children in the northern Caucasus region of Russia. As a result of this terrorist attack, the national strength and control over security in Russia's regions and ended direct elections of the heads of Russia's regional governments in favor of a process that Putin appointed leaders with the approval of the national government. China is a unitary government as well, but has autonomous regions and constitutional protections of language and religious rights of ethnic minority residents in those regions, though that is declining under Xi Jinping, as we're seeing with the Uyghurs. But national government maintains its sovereignty in these regions and can use force and coercion to address separatist movements there. Okay. So as we were saying, this change in relationship can lead to a devolved unitary system, such as happened in the UK. It's not a federal system because, like I said, this power that was given to Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland can be taken away. It is not protected constitutionally in any way. Or it can lead to an asymmetrical federal system, which has happened in Russia, where the central government has been consolidating power, and these constitutionally granted powers of regional governments are taking away. Putin's taking away those powers by changing the constitution. All right. Looking at political legitimacy, which is 1.8, political legitimacy is the degree to which government's right to rule is accepted by the citizens. Okay? The more the citizens accept the government's right to rule, the greater the political legitimacy of the government. So there's several sources of political legitimacy. One is popular elections. And these, of course, have a very strong connection with authority. Many of the sources of political legitimacy are also sources of authority. But popular elections, if a leader or a party wins a popular elections, that's a sign of legitimacy. Constitutional provisions, if they won by following constitutional laws and provisions, that's a sign of legitimacy. Nationalism can, this kind of how every day to how they identify with the state is a sign of legitimacy, which is one of the reasons why some authoritarian leaders, especially, try to promote nationalism as a sign of legitimacy. Putin is famous for this. Tradition, humans, we don't usually like change. We like the way things are usually done. This is one of the things that gives legitimacy to the royal family in the UK, because it's the way it's been done this way for years and years and years. Also, another reason why the UK doesn't really need a written constitution at this point. Ideology. Ideology is a system of ideas that are accepted by people. So if the government is following the majority ideology of the citizens, it is contributing to the legitimacy. Political effectiveness, how well the government can get things done. This, of course, is very important. Probably, I would argue, maybe the most important thing for political legitimacy. How well are they doing what they say they're going to do, taking care of their citizens, protection, all those kind of things. Economic growth. This is one of China's mainstays for political legitimacy of the government, because they might not have human rights, but they have economic growth. It's part of the deal Deng Xiaoping offered Chinese way back when, after Tiananmen Square, and set up the special economic zones. And then finally, religious heritage or organizations, which is one of the mainstays of political legitimacy in Iran. The supreme leader has been selected by an elected group called the Assembly of Religious Experts that were elected by popular vote. And as supreme leader, he is considered the ultimate religious authority in Iran, who interprets Sharia law and applies that to the government to make sure the government is following that or doesn't do anything to violate it. Okay. Looking at characteristics of a democratic regime, generally in a democratic regime, you find stronger political legitimacy than you do in an authoritarian regime. for some very obvious reasons. First of all, demo translates from the Greek of the people or of the people. Democratic regimes tend to have limited government and are accountable to the citizens. They have free, fair, frequent, and competitive elections, very strong protections of civil liberties and rights, and an independent legislature, judiciary, and media, instead of having just one strong executive strongman to kind of rule over everything. So this is one of the things that Freedom House reports on, to look at their how free a country is based on these different things, along with a few others. And if you look at the map from 2019, the countries in green are rated as free. Only one of our 6 countries is that, and that's the UK, who scores a 39 out of 40 for political rights and a 55 out of 60 for civil liberties. Our other countries, China actually is not free. They score a -1 out of 40 for political rights and 11 out of 60 for civil rights. Iran, also low scores, 7 out of 40 for political rights and 10 out of 60 for civil rights, so also not free. Mexico scores a 27 out of 40 for political rights and a 35 out of 60, so they're considered, for civil rights, so they are considered partly free. Nigeria is a 22 out of 40 for political rights and a 25 out of 60 for civil rights, so they're considered partly free. And finally, Russia has a 5 out of 40 for political rights and a 15 out of 60 for civil rights, so they are considered not free. All right, looking at maintaining and sustaining political legitimacy, how governments do this is through many of the same things they maintain through a variety of processes and factors, which include things like political effectiveness, again, how the government action works and how well it works. Political efficacy, this is a new term. Political efficacy refers to how people feel they can understand and influence politics. So they're more likely to maintain government authority if they understand how the government works and feels like they can influence the government. Tradition, once again, can help maintain and sustain legitimacy by continuing to do things the way that they have always been done before. The UK is a perfect example of this. Charismatic leadership, this can inspire exceptional loyalty, such as happened with Mao in China or Lenin in Russia. And finally, institutionalized laws, which establish as part of the official process. And even though Putin has been consolidating power and changing the constitution, he's been doing it within the institutional laws of how to do it. Okay? The government, they can also take actions to reinforce legitimacy, and they can do this in a number of ways as well, through peaceful resolution of conflict, for example, peaceful transfers of power from one party to another or one person to another, the reduction of government corruption, economic development, of course, will reinforce legitimacy. And once again, in there, political effectiveness, as we said, is probably one of the most important ways to do this. So, and then undermining legitimacy, this is another thing that can happen, that governments do that undermine their own legitimacy, not on purpose, but that happens. Increased corruption can undermine legitimacy. Reduced electoral competition, which is what's happening in Hong Kong right now, which is undermining China's legitimacy, Beijing's legitimacy. And then serious problems within the country that the government is not solving, like a poor economy or social conflict, or like the dealing or addressing the coronavirus more currently. So examples from our 6 countries of how they have reinforced legitimacy. China, of course, like we already mentioned, is the economic growth. As long as they keep growing, the majority of people in China are pretty happy with the government. In Iran, the legitimacy is reinforced through the theocracy, through the appeal to religious authority, which religion is very important to the people of Iran. Mexico, The lack of a dominant party allows more power to the state governors to adapt policies and for multi-party competition as well, which both reinforce legitimacy. Nigeria, you have the increased representation of ethnic groups through various parties and through the legislature, all reinforce legitimacy of the government. In Russia, the creation of a dominant party, United Russia, does actually reinforce legitimacy. It sounds kind of counterintuitive, but within Russia it does. And in the UK, devolution to regional parliaments, like we already talked about, allows for local policy innovation. But examples of undermining legitimacy, all 6 of our countries have those examples too. In China, for example, you have the postponement of the Hong Kong elections, as well as Xi Jinping using the courts to crack down on political rivals and dissidents. In Iran, in 2009, you had the Green Revolution, which was mass protests against election fraud when Ahmadinejad was reelected. In Mexico, the 1985 earthquake, which led to over 5,000 deaths, revealed pre-corruption within the government. And then PRI had to use blatant corruption in the 1988 election, blatant fraud in the 1988 election to have Salinas elected as president, which led to the beginnings of the electoral reforms that eventually led to the downfall of PRI. In Nigeria, waves of Boko Haram terrorist activities that the government has not been able to control undermines it, as well as the 2019 election delay when Buhari was reelected. That has never really been properly explained to the satisfaction of many people, which undermined the legitimacy of Buhari's government. In Russia, the 2011 parliamentary elections, which led to the 2012 presidential elections when Vladimir Putin said he's going to stop being prime minister and be president again, so he runs for the 3rd term, which led to mass protests all over the country. And finally, in the UK, the 2016 Brexit vote to leave the European Union, the referendum, is thought to have been influenced by outside sources, by fraud, and by misinformation, which undermines the legitimacy of the Conservative government and Conservative Party. All right, economic policy can also undermine legitimacy. How, you might ask? A couple of examples that from our government or from our countries is it allows for inequality between regions. In China, you have a major urban-rural divide. In China, due to special economic zones, where the majority of the wealth are in the large cities and along the coast, while the rural areas are still in very desperate and extreme poverty. In Mexico, you have a north-south cleavage in Mexico due to NAFTA, where the north part of Mexico is more industrialized and better off economically, where the south is more rural and poor. It can also exacerbate ethnic and local tensions. We see this in environmental protests in the Niger Delta, which is an extremely poor area of Nigeria, even though it's where the majority of the oil in Nigeria is, because of exploitation from oil companies and the environmental damage that these oil companies have done to the region has led to massive protests. And the Zapatista movement in Chiapas, Mexico, which was a direct result of NAFTA, and due to ethnic conflict of people believing that the indigenous people, not having the same kind of political rights and economic opportunities as the mestizos do. So how does governments repair this legitimacy? Once again, policy effectiveness is probably the best way to do this. They can recognize there's an issue, which gets the policy on the agenda for the government to deal with. Representation from the different groups to give them a seat at the political table, which is one of the things they tried after the Zapatista movement, by including, and other protests in Mexico, by including them into the government. And then finally, reform, which would be a new or revised policy to hopefully address the situation. All right, finally, the last section, which is looking at political stability of 1.10. So we're looking at trying to understand how internal factors can interact with state authority to either enhance or threaten political stability. Okay? There are several challenges to political stability that can be from internal or external factors. They can either undermine or bolster the regime's stability. Some of these include things like combating corruption, which could, of course, before I get to that, let me get to this. Combating corruption is a major way to increase political stability. How the state responds to separatist movements such as separatist group violence, drug trafficking, or discrimination based on gender and or religious differences can affect political stability. How the state responds to mass protests, the attempt to limit influence of divisive or violent actors within the state can do that. Internal reform pressure from citizen protest group, and other challenges include things like loss of territory, loss of population, loss of government authority, and loss of sovereignty. So there's different methods, like we said, to combat political corruption, which is one of the main things among our core countries. Some examples of this would be the government of the United Kingdom, Mexico, and Nigeria have all attempted to address and reduce corruption by passing Freedom of Information Acts that allow the public and journalists to access governmental information, even if that information could be used by critics of the government. In China, President Xi Jinping has used the courts and corruption charges to punish nearly 1 million government officials from rival factions within the CCP since 2013 as his war on corruption. Now, that can be considered good or bad, depending on your viewpoint with that. Looking at how they respond to separatist groups, violence, drug trafficking, and discrimination. Iran's constitution mandates the reservation of a few seats in the Majlis, the national legislature, for candidates from certain religious minorities. Christians and Jews are two from the group that have guaranteed representation as a way for the government to show it protects some groups' religious freedom as stated in the Constitution. While allowing women to vote and be licensed driver long before some of the other countries in the Middle East, Iran still draws criticism by human rights activists against gender discrimination policies. For example, Iran often faced international criticism because of governmental rules prohibiting women from attending male soccer events in Iranian stadiums. In Mexico, the national government and local governments have struggled to reduce high-profile violence by the drug cartels since 2006. This has undermined governmental stability and rule of law in Mexico. In 2018, Mexico had more than 33,000 murders, which was a 33% increase in murders from 2017, with the previous record of more than 25,000 murders. In 2014, mass kidnappings and murders of more than 40 college students in Iguala, Mexico, revealed a collusion between local governments and drug cartels, and we're going to talk more about that when we get to political culture. Mass protests took place against the national governmental officials for not addressing the corruption and crime of local governments working with the drug cartels in response to this 2014 mass kidnapping and murders. And in Nigeria, Boko Haram and Islamic separatist groups have killed tens of thousands of Nigerians. Boko Haram's intent was to create an Islamic theocracy in northern Nigeria and used acts of terrorism to try to accomplish this goal. While Nigeria's national military and President Buhari claimed that Boko Haram had been defeated in 2015, the group is still linked to violent terrorist acts that continue in Nigeria. Instability related to domestic violence, of course, is also reflected in the relatively high fragile state index scores that we see in Mexico and Nigeria as compared to the United Kingdom. We see here the fragile state. The lower the score is, the more stable political stability the state has. So we can see of all of these, Nigeria is our least stable of our six countries due to corruption and ethnic tensions for the most part. Looking at responses to mass protest groups that oppose government policies, there is the Green Revolution, as I already mentioned, against electoral fraud in Iran in 2009, which resulted in sweeping oppression by Iran's government towards the protesters and rival political leaders. The government also increased its monitoring of the internet as a way to squash political dissent, and government security forces allowed protesters in support of the government to harass and attack their opponents. Mass protests against electoral fraud in Russia in the 2011 and 12, which I already talked about or mentioned, resulted in many arrests of leaders and violent confrontations with police and security personnel. The government security forces allowed counter-protesters in support, again, of the government to harass and attack the opponents, and Russia's government has passed laws to suppress the criticism of government and organizations of protest with the internet. And then in China in 1989, the Tiananmen Square protest movement in China started with students calling for democratic reforms, following the government's movement towards neoliberal economic reforms in some of China's economic sectors. As the size of the protest grew, factions within the CCP opposed the democratic reforms and chose to violently suppress the protest. Estimates of the death toll from the crackdown on protesters range anywhere from 300 to more than 10,000 in what some Chinese call the June 4th incident. Any discussions of democratic political reform in China were halted, and the CCP Politburo members who supported the protest were removed from power. China's current leadership denies that the protest even occurred and blocks any reference to the protest and crackdown on the internet in China. There's also different ways to attempt to limit the influence of divisive and violent actors in the countries, as listed on here. And the reason why they want to do this is try to attract more private capital and foreign direct investment to improve economic growth. One of the problems Mexico has is the inability to reduce crime related to drug cartels can diminish political legitimacy in Mexico, as well as impact vital economic industries. Mexico's tourism centers grow increasingly worried about the crime related to drug cartels that will reduce visits by foreigners. And drug cartels have increasingly targeted Mexico's gas and oil lines to steal fuel. We also have internal reform pressure from citizen protest groups and civil society, which can lead to the creation of new political institutions or policies to protect civil liberties, improve transparency, address election fairness and media bias, limit corruption, and ensure equality under law. So, for example, the governments of Mexico, the United Kingdom, and Nigeria have all attempted to address and reduce corruption by passing, like I already said, the Freedom of Information Act that allow the public to get access to governmental information. And Mexico's government has also created the National Electoral Institute, the INE, in 1990 to try to ensure fair elections after PRI used widespread electoral fraud to steal the 1988 election from a rival party. Nigeria also has its independent National Electoral Commission since 1998, prior to elections under its current constitution. So that is the end of Unit 1, and bye.